My uncle laughed when I refused to throw away what reminded me of Grandma. What happened next turned my life upside down. Life has this funny way of going from completely normal to utterly screwed in the span of a phone call. That's how it happened for me. Anyway, one minute I was underneath a 2012 Chevy Malibu trying to figure out why the transmission was making that weird clicking sound. And the next I was sitting on the cold concrete floor of the garage, trying to process the news that my grandma Grace was gone. Let me back up a bit. I'm Alex, 29, washed-up former college student turned small-town mechanic. I live in a rented trailer on the outskirts of Redford, Michigan, one of those places that had its heyday back when American manufacturing was still a thing. Now it's just dollar stores, shuttered factories, and people trying to get by. My parents died in a car crash during my sophomore year of college. Drunk driver crossed the median on I-75. After that, I couldn't focus on engineering textbooks anymore, so I dropped out. Grandma Grace was all the family I had left. She came to America from Hungary in the 1960s with nothing but a suitcase and recipes memorized from her mother. Never talked much about the old country, except to say it was beautiful but harsh, like winter sunshine. Every summer as a kid, I'd stay with her while my parents worked. Her house always smelled like sugar and fruit cooking down on the stove. I can still see 6-year-old me sitting at her wooden kitchen table, chin barely above the surface, watching her make strawberry jam. The way the bubbles would rise and pop in a rhythm. She'd tap her wooden spoon on the edge of the pot and tell me that when the bubbles danced just right, the jam was telling its story. Cooking is storytelling without words, she used to say. You listen with your nose and taste with your heart. As I got older and our visits became less frequent, she started sending me what I called her flavor letters, mason jars of homemade jam with handwritten labels explaining why she made that specific flavor. Ginger and honey for your winter cough. Cherry chocolate because you got that promotion. They'd arrive randomly, sometimes with no explanation at all, just when I needed them most, like she had some kind of grandma radar that could detect when I was having a rough week. After the funeral, which was small enough to make me realize how isolated she'd become, I met my Uncle Robert, her son and supposedly successful businessman who I'd only seen twice in my life. He wore an expensive suit that looked out of place in Grandma's modest living room, checking his watch every few minutes like he had somewhere more important to be. He barely looked at me when he said they were putting the house on the market in a week. No discussion, no sentimental pause, nothing. Just business. There are some old jars in the basement, about 25 of them, he mentioned, scrolling through emails on his phone. You can take them if you want. Otherwise, they'll be tossed with the rest. The rest, like her life, could be sorted into keep and trash piles that easily. The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I went down alone. It smelled like earth and laundry detergent, with that distinctive mustiness that all Midwestern basements have. I found the old wooden cabinet right where it had always been, tucked in the corner next to the washing machine. Inside were rows of glass jars, each with Grandma's distinctive handwriting on paper labels tied with twine. But these weren't random. They were a timeline of my life. Apple cinnamon, the day Alex got a scholarship. Blueberry, for nights when nightmares come. Peach with vanilla when he fixed his first engine. 25 jars of memories, each one tied to a moment in my life that I'd forgotten but she preserved. Some labels were so specific they made my chest hurt. Raspberry lemon, when he was afraid to go back to school after the bullying. Between the jars was a yellowed notebook filled with recipes in 3 languages. English, something that looked like Polish, and what I assumed was Hungarian. Tucked into the first page was a small black and white photo of young Grandma Grace, standing by a stove in what looked like an old farmhouse kitchen. Her smile exactly the same as I remembered it 60 years later. At that moment, my friend Jason came clomping down the stairs. He'd driven up from Detroit to be my emotional support, though he clearly felt awkward in the house of someone he'd never met. Looking at the jars, he let out a low whistle. Dude, what are you going to do with all this jam? Your trailer barely has room for your PlayStation. I stared at the glass jars glinting in the dim basement light, each one containing not just fruit and sugar, but something far more precious, Proof that someone had paid attention to my life, had marked its passages with care and sweetness. "I'm not letting this disappear," I said quietly. "This is all I have left." My buddy didn't get it, but he helped me wrap each jar in newspaper and pack them carefully into cardboard boxes. We carried them up the stairs past Uncle Robert, who was on the phone with a realtor. He paused his conversation to watch us haul the boxes out. "Always were sentimental, just like her," he said, shaking his head like it was some kind of character flaw. Maybe it is. But as I carefully arranged those 25 jars in the back seat of my beat-up Honda Civic with its cracked windshield, I couldn't help thinking that being sentimental, caring deeply about things that have no monetary value, might be the only thing keeping me from becoming like him. The drive back to my trailer was tense, every bump in the road making me wince as I imagined the sound of breaking glass. Those jars had traveled from a Hungarian kitchen to America, survived years in Grandma's basement, and now they were my responsibility. The last physical pieces of a woman who'd crafted her love into something tangible I could taste. As I turned onto the rutted dirt road leading to my trailer, the setting sun hit my rearview mirror, illuminating the boxes in my back seat with golden light. For a split second, the glass jars caught the sunbeams and threw tiny rainbows across the interior of my car. "I'll keep them safe, Grandma," I whispered to myself. "Whatever story they're telling, I'm listening now." Little did I know then that those 25 jars of jam would change everything. My career, my purpose, even how I define family. But that's how life works sometimes. The most important things don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive in ordinary packages, tucked away in basements, waiting for someone to recognize their value. Sometimes legacy isn't about money or achievements. Sometimes it's preserved in sugar and fruit, sealed with paraffin wax and labeled with love. Getting those jars into my trailer took some serious Tetra skills. The place isn't much, just a single wide with paneling from the 80s and carpet that's seen better days. But it's mine. Well, mine and the bank's for the next 57 payments. I cleared off my one bookshelf, the cheap parkerboard one from Walmart, that was sagging under the weight of paperbacks and car manuals. The jars needed to be displayed properly, not hidden away in a cabinet somewhere. Each one deserved to be seen. I arranged them in chronological order based on the dates Grandma had written on the labels, setting up a little shrine with her photograph, the one from her 75th birthday when I surprised her with a visit, right in the center. When I finished, I collapsed onto my worn-out couch and just stared at them, these glass time capsules glowing amber, ruby, and purple in the evening light. 25 jars, 25 stories, and me, with no clue what to do with them. What am I supposed to do with you guys? I asked aloud to the empty room. That first night back, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the funeral. Uncle Robert's dismissive attitude, the hollow feeling of walking through Grandma's house knowing she'd never be there again. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and wandered to the kitchen. My eyes landed on jar number 1. Strawberry from 2018, the year I got fired from my first mechanic job for mouthing off to a customer who'd been treating me like garbage. The seal made that satisfying pop when I opened it. The smell hit me first. Sweet, bright, somehow both familiar and extraordinary. One spoonful, and suddenly I wasn't in my trailer anymore. I was 17, following Grandma through the U-Pick strawberry farm just outside Redford. She moved slowly between the rows, ignoring the big, picture-perfect berries that everyone else was grabbing. "Not those," she'd said, guiding my hand deeper into the plants. "Look for the ones that smell like sunshine. Size doesn't matter. Color doesn't matter. Trust your nose, Alex." I'd felt ridiculous, sniffing strawberries while the family next to us efficiently filled their buckets. But she was right. The smaller berries tucked away from sight had an intensity that made the showy one seem watery in comparison. "Life is the same way," she told me, her Hungarian accent getting stronger as it always did when she was sharing wisdom. "The most valuable things aren't always obvious. You have to look carefully." Sitting in my darkened trailer with that jar of strawberry jam, I couldn't stop the tears. Not just for Grandma, but for the 17-year-old kid who'd had no idea that one day those strawberries would be his connection to someone gone. How many moments had I rushed through without stopping to pay attention? How many people had I taken for granted? After that night, I started a routine. Every evening after my shift at Parker's Auto, I'd choose one jar, open it, and let the flavors bring back whatever memory was attached. Some nights the memories were crystal clear. Other nights, I had to piece things together, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. I began recording these sessions on my phone. Nothing fancy, just me, sitting at my cluttered coffee table, telling stories about each jar. At first, it was just for myself, a way to process grief that felt less pathetic than crying into a pillow. This is jar number 7. I'd say to my phone's camera. Raspberry mint from when I was 11 and broke my arm falling off my bike on Oakmont Drive. Grandma made this and told me it would help my courage come back. I was so afraid to get on a bike again, but she said courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the thing anyway. Maybe it was a lack of sleep or the way grief can make you do weird things. But 3 weeks after the funeral, I posted one of these videos on TikTok. I had exactly 26 followers, mostly guys from work, and a few high school friends I barely talk to anymore. I didn't expect anything to happen. The first comments were exactly what you'd expect. Dude crying over jam? That's a new level of down bad. Is this some weird food fetish thing? Bro needs therapy, not preserves. I almost deleted the account that night, but then other comments started trickling in. My grandma baked bread every Sunday. After she died, I couldn't eat bread for a year. This hit me hard, man. I would give anything to taste my mom's apple pie one more time. Never got the recipe before she passed. Just lost my dad last month. Found his coffee mug in the dishwasher and had a breakdown. Grief is weird like that. Something about the vulnerability of eating jam on camera while talking about my dead grandmother resonated with people in a way I never expected. Maybe because it wasn't polished or planned. It was just raw grief and a guy trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. By jar number 10, blackberry lavender that Grandma made after I'd been having panic attacks during my first semester at college, I had over 30,000 followers. People were waiting for each new jar, invested in the stories, sharing their own memories in the comments. I started putting more effort into the videos, creating a ritual around opening each jar. I'd light a candle, show the label up close, and tell the story behind it before tasting. Sometimes I'd try to recreate the memory, like sitting on the hood of my car to eat jar number 14, because it was made after Grandma, and I had watched a meteor shower from the top of her old Buick. Jason showed up at my trailer one Saturday morning in late October. I hadn't been answering his texts, and I called in sick to work 3 times that week. "Dude, your boss called me," he said, stepping over the pile of laundry just inside my door. He said if you miss another shift, don't bother coming back. What the hell is going on with you? My coffee table was covered with open jars, sticky spoons, and my phone on a makeshift tripod made from stacked books. I hadn't shaved in days. Jason looked at the setup, then at the half-empty shelf where 11 jars remained. "This isn't healthy, man. It's jam, not medicine." I couldn't make him understand. How could I explain that each jar was a finite resource? That once they were gone, I'd have nothing left of her? That when I ate that jam, the barrier between past and present dissolved, and for just a moment, she wasn't gone? "You don't get it," I told him. "When I taste these, she's here with me. It's like time travel through taste buds." Jason left concerned, and I went back to my jars and my growing audience online. There was something oddly comforting about sharing my grief with strangers who couldn't judge me or get freaked out by the intensity of my feelings. That's when Ella messaged me. It was after I'd posted about jar number 12, paired with cardamom that Grandma had made when I dropped out of college after my parents died. Her message was different from the usual comments. "My father died 2 years ago. I still can't look at his tools in the garage. Your video about jar number 12 made me cry." And then, smile. "First time in a long time. Thank you for showing it's okay to grieve however we need to." We started messaging back and forth. Ella was a pastry chef in a town about an hour away. She understood food as memory, food as connection in a way that even Grandma might have appreciated. As the jars dwindled, anxiety crept in. My followers, now over 15,000, were asking the question I couldn't bear to think about. What happens after the last jar is at the end. I was down to the final 7 jars when I finally opened Grandma's recipe notebook. I'd been avoiding it, partly out of reverence and partly out of fear. As long as I didn't open it, I could pretend she might walk to the door and explain everything in it to me. The notebook was worn, the pages wavy from humidity and time. Most of it was filled with recipes, written in English, Hungarian, and what I later learned was Romanian. But the first page wasn't a recipe at all. It was an inscription in all 3 languages. Recipes are for those who remember that taste is a story of love. I ran my fingers over her handwriting. Notice how it changed from the precise script of the earliest recipes to the slightly shakier hand of her later years. This wasn't just a collection of instructions. It was her life, her heritage, her way of loving people through food. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. As I spooned the last bite of jar number 19, peach bourbon that she'd made to celebrate my 21st birthday, I looked at the remaining 6 jars on my shelf, and then at the recipe book. The story couldn't end with the last jar. That's not what Grandma would have wanted. She didn't leave me these jars in this book so I could become a shrine keeper, preserving them until they were too old to eat. She left them so the story could continue. I didn't know the first thing about making jam. I'd never preserved anything in my life, except maybe some leftovers that got lost in the back of my fridge. But I had her recipes. I had her stories. And maybe that was enough to start. As I closed jar number 19 and set it with the empties, my collection of ghosts, I felt something shift inside me. Grief wasn't just about what I'd lost. It was also about what I'd been given. The text message from my boss came on a Tuesday morning while I was filming myself opening jar number 20. No dramatic build-up, no in-person conversation, just 5 words. Don't bother coming in anymore. I can't say I was surprised. 3 missed shifts in 1 week would test anyone's patience, let alone the 5 I'd accumulated over the past month. Parker's Auto wasn't exactly swimming in business, but they weren't desperate enough to keep an unreliable mechanic on payroll. So there I was, unemployed, sitting on my couch in a trailer that suddenly seemed much smaller, surrounded by empty jam jars and a dwindling bank account. I checked my balance online, $115.47. Not even enough for next month's lot rent. The responsible thing would have been to immediately start job hunting, update my resume, call other garages in the area, maybe even look into warehouse work at the Amazon facility that had opened outside town. Instead, I found myself staring at Grandma Grace's recipe book, the last 6 jars of her jam lined up on the shelf like the final witnesses to her life. An idea started forming. Ridiculous, impractical, probably doomed to fail, but grabbed hold and wouldn't let go. I'll try making it myself. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exciting. I had never made anything more complicated than boxed mac and cheese. My culinary skills topped out at ordering the right combination of items from the Taco Bell value menu. But Grandma's recipes were there, written in her careful hand, and I had over 15,000 people online who seemed invested in the journey. The next morning, I scraped together enough cash for supplies. The local grocery store had strawberries on sale. Not the plump, perfect ones on the front display, but the slightly bruised ones marked down in plastic containers. I remembered Grandma's words about the smaller berries having more flavor and filled my basket. Thankfully, my unemployment benefits kicked in after 2 weeks of paperwork and phone calls. I also sold my collection of vintage car parts that I'd been saving for a project car I'd never have time to build now. Between that, the small donation jar I'd set up on my videos, and Jason occasionally dropping off groceries that were about to expire anyway, his excuse for helping without making me feel like a charity case, I managed to keep a roof over my head and fund my jam experiments. Sugar was next, the cheap store brand in the 10-pound bag, because it was on sale. Mason jars proved trickier. New ones were expensive, so I hit up a local thrift store and found a dusty box of used ones for $3. Some had faded labels from previous contents. Pickles, sauerkraut, something unidentifiable. I figured a good washing would fix that. Back at the trailer, I spread everything out on my tiny counter and opened Grandma's notebook to her strawberry jam recipe. The instructions seemed straightforward enough. Mash berries, add sugar, boil, pour into jars. How hard could it be? Turns out, incredibly hard. My first attempt burned to the bottom of my only pot within 15 minutes. The thick, black sludge smelled nothing like Grandma's kitchen, and everything like failure. I scraped the charred remains into trash and started over with my remaining strawberries. The second batch refused to thicken, remaining stubbornly liquid even after an hour of boiling. By then, my trailer had filled with a humid, sticky fog that clung to every surface. Sweat poured down my face as I stared at the watery red mixture, willing it to become jam. When I tried to pour into jars anyway, the thin liquid sloshed everywhere. Counters, floor, my last clean t-shirt. The mess was spectacular, something worthy of a sitcom kitchen disaster. Then came the real problems. I'd skipped the part about sterilizing jars properly, so my third attempt grew a fascinating layer of fuzzy white mold within 3 days. The fourth batch seemed promising until I tried to process the jars in my unreliable oven, and 2 of them cracked from thermal shock, sending glass and half-set jam across the inside of my oven. By week 2, my neighbors had started knocking on my door, concerned about the burning smells and occasional sounds of frustration. Okay, fine yelling, coming from my trailer. My landlord left a note warning about unauthorized food production businesses violating the terms of my lease. Late one night, as I stood over yet another failed batch, this one oddly gritty, like someone had mixed sand into berries, I could have sworn I heard Grandma's voice as clearly as if she stood beside me. Not the recipe, Alex. Listen to the fruit. They will tell you when they're ready. It sounded like mystical nonsense, the kind of thing that works in movies but falls flat in real life. But I was desperate enough to try anything, so I turned off the burner, closed my eyes, and just listened. Not with my ears, but with all my senses. The bubbling sound had a particular rhythm. The smell had changed from raw and sharp to something deeper, more complex. When I stirred, the mixture moved differently against the spoon. I was so absorbed in this moment of quiet recognition that I didn't hear Jason knocking. He'd used his emergency key to let himself in, stopping short when he saw me standing motionless at the stove with my eyes closed. "Dude," he said, startling me out of my trance. What the hell happened here? The trailer looked like a crime scene, if the victim had been a bushel of strawberries. Red splatter marks decorated the walls. Used pots and measuring cups covered every surface. I stood in the middle of it all with blistered fingers and a streak of jam in my unwashed hair. "Grandma made it look so easy," I said, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of 2 weeks of failed attempts. I can't let her go." To his credit, Jason didn't lecture me. He just rolled up his sleeves and helped clean the worst of the mess. When he came back the next evening, he brought a book on food safety and canning that he'd checked out from the library. "If you're going to be the jam guy, at least don't poison your followers," he said, dropping the book on my counter. "And maybe open a window before you burn this place down." That same week, Ella, the pastry chef I'd been messaging with, sent a long email with detailed tips about pectin, acidity, and the proper testing methods for gel stage. She explained things the recipe assumed I already knew. Why you need to skim the foam, how to test for doneness with a frozen plate, the importance of proper headspace in the jars. It took 3 months of daily attempts, countless failed batches, and every penny of my unemployment checks. But eventually, I produced a single batch of raspberry jam that looked, smelled, and tasted like something Grandma might have made. Not identical. I could still detect subtle differences, but close enough that eating it brought tears to my eyes. I filmed the entire process, talking about what I'd learned, sharing Grandma's philosophy as I understood it. My grandmother used to say that jam is a way to stop time, to preserve summer for winter, joy for sorrow. Every jar holds more than fruit and sugar. It holds a moment that would otherwise be lost. The video hit 200,000 views in 2 days. Ella's messages became more frequent, her advice more detailed. Eventually, she suggested meeting in person to show me some techniques that were difficult to explain in text. I hesitated. My trailer was a disaster, and so was I, unshaven, surviving on ramen and jam sandwiches, wearing the same 3 t-shirts in rotation. I'm not really in great shape right now. I told her, maybe when I get this jam thing figured out. But Ella wasn't easily deterred. The following weekend, she made the hour-long drive to my trailer park, texting only 20 minutes before arrival to prevent me from backing out. When I opened the door, there she was, petite with dark curly hair pulled back in a bandana, wearing a flour-dusted t-shirt that read, "Bake the world a better place." Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of my trailer transformed into what looked like a mad scientist's lab. Every surface was covered with canning equipment, recipe books, notebooks filled with my failed attempts, and of course, jars. Both Grandma's originals and my experimental batches, labeled with dates and notes. Instead of being horrified, Ella seemed impressed by my dedication. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, showing me how a professional handles things I'd been struggling with for months. Her movements were confident, precise, and somehow still relaxed, just like I remembered Grandma's being. By evening, we had produced a batch of raspberry jam that was not just edible, but genuinely good. Ella helped me calculate costs, write down the exact process, and create a proper recipe that someone else could follow. "You know," Jason said a few days later as he sampled a successful batch, "if you're serious about this, you need a better name than Sad Dude's Jam Company." He had a point. I'd been so focused on figuring out the how that I hadn't given much thought to turning this into an actual business. But with my growing online following and a recipe that finally worked, it suddenly seemed possible. That night, lying in bed, I thought about what to call this thing that had started as grief therapy and was evolving into something more. The answer came to me just as I was drifting off, a play on Grandma's name that also described what I was trying to do with each jar. Graceful Jars was born the next morning, with a simple logo I designed using a free online tool, a mason jar with a small heart inside it. Nothing fancy, but it felt right. My first sales were literally out of my trailer. Followers who lived nearby started messaging, asking if they could buy a jar. Then a local farmer's market manager, who'd seen my videos, offered me a spot at the Saturday market. I spent that Friday making a batch of raspberry jam, printing basic labels at the library, and borrowing a folding table from Jason. At the market, I didn't just sell jam, I told stories. About Grandma Grace, about the tradition she carried from Hungary, about the way food connects us to the people we've lost. People lingered at my makeshift booth, sharing their own stories of family recipes and loved ones gone, but remembered through taste and smell. Everything was going great until a man in a pressed shirt and khakis approached my table, introduced himself as a county health inspector, and informed me that selling homemade preserves from an unlicensed kitchen was a violation of about 17 different regulations. "Either get a licensed commercial kitchen or I'll have to issue fines," he said, handing me a clipboard full of intimidating paperwork. "I'll give you 2 weeks to comply." I sat in my truck after the market closed, looking at rental prices for a commercial kitchen space. The cheapest was $25 per hour, with a minimum 4-hour booking. There was no way I could afford that on my current sales. Graceful Jars was finished before it had really begun. That evening, I called Ella to share the bad news. Instead of sympathy, she offered a solution. The bakery where I work is closed Monday nights. The owner is an older Italian lady who has a soft spot for preserving traditions. She might let you use the kitchen for a reasonable fee. 2 days later, I found myself touring Sophia's Bakery, a small but immaculate commercial kitchen owned by Sophia Ricci, who reminded me so much of Grandma Grace it was almost eerie. She listened to my story, examined my jam samples, and flipped through Grandma's recipe book with careful hands that understood its value. "My nana taught me to make limoncello when I was 9, she said, closing the book gently. "Nobody makes it like she did, but I try. Every Christmas, I try." She looked at me with understanding. Monday nights, $50 flat fee. Make as much as you can. Just leave my kitchen clean. As I drove home with keys to Sophia's Bakery in my pocket, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Grandma died. Hope. Not just for Graceful Jars as a business, but for myself, for the possibility that grief doesn't have to be just an ending. Sometimes it can be a beginning too. It's wild how fast a year can change everything. One minute you're an unemployed mechanic living on ramen and unemployment checks. The next you're trying to figure out how to fulfill orders for 500 jars of artisanal jam while maintaining your newfound social media brand. Not that I'm complaining, just still adjusting to the whiplash. Exactly 1 year after Grandma Grace passed away, my TikTok following hit 200,000. My small online store, run through a basic website Ella helped me set up, couldn't keep up with demand. Every batch I made at Sophia's bakery sold out within hours of me posting about it. I was spending more on shipping supplies than I was on food for myself. The Monday night arrangement at the bakery wasn't cutting it anymore. I needed my own space, somewhere I could work more than once a week and scale up production without sacrificing quality. After weeks of searching, I found a small retail space on the edge of town that had previously been a coffee shop. The rent was reasonable for Michigan anyway, and it already had most of the kitchen equipment I needed. With my savings from jam sales and a small loan from Sophia, who insisted on becoming my first official investor, I signed a 1-year lease and began transforming the space into what would become Graceful Kitchen. I painted the walls the same warm yellow as Grandma's kitchen, installed shelving to display both empty and filled jars, and set up a small retail area in the front where customers could sample flavors before buying. The grand opening was nothing fancy, just me nervously cutting a ribbon while Jace recorded for TikTok, and about 30 local followers who've been buying my jam since the early days. Sophia brought pastries from her bakery. Ella, who by then had become much more than just my jam consultant, made a special cake shaped like a mason jar. But with growth came the inevitable growing pains. The question that kept me up at night wasn't about recipes or techniques anymore. I'd mastered those. It was more philosophical. How do you preserve the soul of something personal when you need to make 100 jars instead of 10? Each batch had always been a meditation of sorts, a connection to Grandma and the stories behind her recipes. When I made jam in my trailer, or even at Sophia's, I could focus on each jar as if it were the only one that mattered. Now, with orders piling up and production schedules to meet, I worried that Graceful jars would become just another food product, the very thing I'd been determined to avoid. This wasn't just about jam. It was about preserving memory, about connecting people to their own stories through taste. If I lost that, what was the point? When the small business loan officer at Redford Community Bank asked about my 5-year growth strategy, I talked about stories and connections rather than profit margins and market expansion. I showed him the notebooks filled with messages from followers about how my videos had helped them process their own grief. I explained why I insisted on hand-writing a note for each order, even as my hand cramped from signing hundreds a week. The loan committee's rejection letter was polite, but clear. Unstable business model. Overly sentimental approach. Insufficient scalability projections. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. Then I remembered something Grandma always said about rejection. The no's just clear the path to the right yes. I fished the letter out, smoothed it flat, and pinned it to my office wall as a reminder. That night, I posted a candid video about the challenges of growing while staying true to Graceful Jar's mission. I wasn't asking for anything, just thinking out loud about the balance between business and heart. The response blindsided me. A follower created a GoFundMe campaign called Save Graceful Jars. Others shared across platforms I'd never even been on. Within a week, the campaign had raised $45,000 from people around the country who connected with the idea that businesses could be about more than just profit. The local newspaper picked up the story. Former mechanic finds gold in Grandma's recipes. They ran a full-page spread with photos of the kitchen and quotes from customers about what Graceful Jars meant to them. The reporter seemed particularly interested in the transformation angle, from greasy hands fixing engines to carefully stirring pots of jam. With the unexpected influx of funds, I could finally address the scaling issue on my own terms. But instead of just buying bigger equipment or hiring random staff, I had an idea that felt right for what Graceful Jars had become. There was a senior living center about a mile from my shop. On a hunch, I reached out to their activities coordinator and proposed a partnership. I would pay residents who were interested in sharing their family recipes and helping with production. not as charity, but as valuable team members with wisdom and skills I needed. The first group consisted of 4 women in their 70s and 80s, Martha, Dolores, Ruth, and Betty. Each brought decades of home canning experience and family recipes that had never been written down. More importantly, they brought stories that made each recipe come alive. Martha's peach jam recipe came from her years in Georgia, where her husband had been stationed at Fort Benning. Dolores had a blackberry recipe that her grandmother had used during the Depression to stretch what little sugar they could afford. Ruth's apple butter was famous in 3 counties, with a secret ingredient she'd only reveal in person to serious jam enthusiasts. These weren't just employees. They were living libraries of culinary knowledge. Working alongside them transformed Graceful jars from my personal grief project into something bigger. Together, we developed a heritage recipe series, where each jar included the story of the family behind it, complete with photos and memories that the senior partners shared. The marketing experts would probably say I was diluting my brand. Instead of Alex's grandmother's jam, it was now becoming a collective of grandmother's jams. But it felt right. It felt like growth in the true sense. Not just getting bigger, but getting richer, more textured, more connected. The emails and messages continued to pour in, but one in particular stood out. A woman from a domestic violence shelter wrote that she'd started watching my videos during her first weeks at the shelter, when she couldn't sleep and needed something common to focus on. My story of starting over after loss had inspired her to launch a small cookie business operating out of a church kitchen. She was now making enough to rent her own apartment and stay independent from her abuser. Those moments made all the late nights and burned fingertips worth it. This wasn't just about selling jam anymore. It was about showing people that you could rebuild after loss, that you could create something meaningful from grief, that the end of one story could be the beginning of another. Then came the email that would force me to find exactly what Graceful Jars was meant to be. A regional grocery chain with stores across 3 states wanted to stock my products. The initial order would be for 5,000 jars, more than I'd made in an entire previous year. The money would be life-changing. The exposure would be incredible. But the requirements were daunting. Standardized recipes, consistent production schedules, minimum volume guarantees, no handwritten notes, no variation between batches. I printed the email and took it to my weekly meeting with the seniors. We sat around the big prep table, reading through the terms while sharing Ruth's famous cinnamon rolls. They want to turn us into Smuckers, Betty said, pushing her glasses up her nose. Martha shrugged. Maybe that's just how it goes. Small becomes big or disappears. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced around my apartment. Yes, I finally moved out of the trailer, trying to imagine Graceful Jars products lined up on grocery store shelves. Anonymous, mass-produced, removed from the stories that gave them meaning. Around 3 a.m., the solution came to me. I fired up my laptop and spent the rest of the night researching and planning. By morning, I had a counter-proposal for the grocery chain. Each jar would feature a QR code linking to a video about that specific batch, who made it, the story behind the recipe, even footage of the actual cooking process. Small batch production would remain our model, with clear batch numbers so customers could see the human hands behind their purchase. We'd agree to their volume requirements, but not by sacrificing our process. Instead, by expanding our senior partner program to more retirement communities. To my shock, they accepted. The purchasing manager called personally. My mother collects your jars. She'd kill me if I made you change what makes them special. Just as things were falling into place, a familiar face appeared at the door of Graceful Kitchen one Tuesday afternoon. Uncle Robert, looking exactly as I remembered him from the funeral. Expensive suit, perpetual frown, emanating impatience. He stood in the center of the shop, examining the jars and photos on display, like he was conducting an audit. "I saw you on the local news," he said when I emerged from the kitchen. Not bad for a jam guy. I wiped my hands on my apron, unsure how to respond. "What do you want, Robert?" "I want to invest." He pulled a business card from his pocket. Embossed lettering, heavyweight stock. This is a family business, after all. The irony nearly knocked me over. This man, who couldn't wait to sell his mother's house, who dismissed her jars as worthless, who hadn't spoken to me once in a year since her funeral, now wanted a piece of what I'd built from those very jars. Family isn't just blood, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. It's the people who preserve your stories. I gestured to the wall of photos. Grandma Grace, the senior partners, Ella, Jason, Sophia, and dozens of customers who'd share their own family recipes and memories. This is my family now. Robert's face hardened, but before he could respond, the door chimed as Martha arrived for her shift, followed by 2 new senior partners I'd recently hired. They greeted me with hugs and immediately began discussing the experimental batch we'd planned for the day. Your grandmother would have been proud, Robert said finally, an unexpected softness in his voice. She always said you had her spirit. He placed his business card on the counter. The offer stands, family or not. I watched him leave, the business card untouched. His approval meant nothing to me anymore. Yet his words about Grandma stayed with me as I rejoined my team in the kitchen. 6 months later, we opened Grace's Pantry, next door to Production Kitchen. Not just a retail shop, but a gathering space where people could bring recipes, share stories, and learn to make their own preserved memories. We hosted workshops taught by the senior partners, special events where families could preserve their own food history, and regular story circles, where people shared memories connected to tastes and smells. On opening day, I hung a large photo of Grandma Grace above the entrance, along with her words that have become our unofficial motto. When life turns bitter, add more sugar and cook it longer. Sometimes I still go back to my old trailer and sit on the steps, thinking about that version of me who loaded 25 jars of jam into his beat-up Honda, having no idea where they would lead. Grief has a way of emptying you out completely, but maybe that emptiness is necessary sometimes. It makes room for something new to grow. I didn't save Grandma's jars after all. They saved me, and in the process, create a space where others could preserve what mattered most to them too, not just flavors, but the connections and memories that give those flavors meaning. That's the thing about preservation. Done right, it doesn't just stop time. It gives time a place to live on. 3 years after finding those 25 jars in Grandma Grace's basement, my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined. Graceful Jars isn't just a business anymore. It's a movement that's touched thousands of lives across the country. Sometimes I wake up in my new house, an actual house with a yard and everything, not a trailer, and have to pinch myself to make sure I'm not dreaming. The house isn't anything fancy by most standards, a modest 3-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street in Redford. But after years of renting cramped spaces, having a mortgage feels like a luxury. The first thing I did after moving in was create a special room dedicated to Grandma Grace's memory. I restored her old kitchen table, hung photos of her throughout the years, and displayed the empty jars from her original 25, now washed, sterilized, and arranged chronologically on custom shelves. The room has become my sanctuary. When product development gets overwhelming or investor meetings drag on too long, I retreat there to remember why I started this journey in the first place. Last summer, I finally made the trip to Hungary, to the small village outside Budapest where Grandma Grace was born. With the help of a local guide, I found distant relatives who welcomed me like I'd been there all along. They took me to the farmhouse where she grew up, now owned by another family, but still standing with its outdoor summer kitchen, where generations of women had preserved the summer harvest. I returned with a suitcase full of paprika, special spices only available in local markets, and handwritten recipes from second and third cousins I hadn't known existed. Most precious was a small wooden spoon that my great-grandmother had used for jam making, gifted to me by an elderly woman who remembered Grandma Grace as a young girl before she left for America. Ella and I got married in a small ceremony at Grace's Pantry, surrounded by our unconventional family. The senior partners who've been with us from the beginning, Jason and his new wife, Sophia from the bakery, and faces from across the country who become part of our community. Uncle Robert even showed up, awkwardly formal but making an effort, bringing a wedding gift of Grandma's old family photos he'd found in a box while cleaning out his attic. Ella's pastry background and my jam making created a perfect business synergy, but more importantly, we balance each other in life. Where I'm impulsive and emotion-driven, she's methodical and practical. Where she overthinks, I remind her to trust her instincts. Together, we've expanded Graceful jars beyond what I could have accomplished alone. The company now operates community kitchens in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, spaces where people can come to preserve their own food memories under the guidance of our trained staff, many of whom started as customers looking to reconnect with their heritage. Each location has its own memory wall, where participants leave photos and stories about the recipes they preserved. Our newest initiative, Jars of Hope, brings jam-making workshops to people in crisis: cancer treatment centers, homeless shelters, veterans groups, and addiction recovery programs. There's something about the slow, methodical process of making jam that creates space for healing conversations. The repetitive actions of stirring, the sensory experience of fruit and sugar transforming, the tangible result of creating something lasting, all serves as a powerful metaphor for rebuilding a life after trauma. Not that everything has been smooth sailing. Growth brings complications, and maintaining the soul of Graceful jars while meeting increasing demand remains our biggest challenge. Last week, after an exhausting day of meetings with a potential major investor who kept pushing for production efficiencies and strategic pivots toward more profitable demographics, I came home feeling defeated. The investor, representing a large food conglomerate, had made an attractive offer to buy a controlling stake in Graceful jars. The money would secure our future and fund expansion into every state. But his vision for the company involved centralized production, eliminating the senior partner program as inefficient, and focusing on our most commercially viable flavors rather than heritage recipes that told important stories. Too tired to cook, I made a peanut butter sandwich and wandered into Grandma's room, staring at the empty jars that had started it all. Only one of the original 25 remained full, the last jar I'd never opened. It sat apart from the others, its label slightly different. Instead of a flavor description and date, it simply read, "For Alex, open when you feel you've lost your way." For 3 years, I preserved this jar, saving for some undefined future emergency. Tonight felt like that moment had arrived. With slightly trembling hands, I opened the jar. The seal popped with that familiar sound that had become the soundtrack to my life. But this time, there was something unexpected. A small envelope tucked under the lid, sealed with wax and slightly stained with condensation. Inside was a handwritten note from Grandma Grace. "Dear Alex, if you're reading this, I'm already with your grandfather in heaven. Remember that jam, like life, doesn't always turn out right the first time. Sometimes it burns. Sometimes it's not as sweet as you like. But what matters most isn't the taste. It's the love you make it with and the people you share it with. Don't be afraid of change, but never forget why you started. The recipe can evolve, but the heart must remain. All my love, now and always, Grandma Grace." The jam itself was simple strawberry, the very first kind she ever taught me make as a child sitting at her kitchen table. I took a small taste, and in that moment, she was there with me, as present as if she were sitting across the table. I slept better that night than I had in months. Grandma's note on my bedside table. In the morning, I called an emergency meeting with our entire leadership team. Ella, the senior partners who now serve as regional managers, our marketing director, and our operations lead. When everyone had gathered in our conference room, I passed around copies of Grandma's note. "We're not selling a controlling stake to conglomerate," I announced. "We're not scaling back the senior program, centralizing production, or limiting our heritage recipes. We're storytellers first, jam makers second. If we lose that, we lose everything that makes us special." There were practical concerns. Of course, turning down an investment meant we'd grow more slowly. Some of our expansion plans would need to be delayed. But as we brainstormed alternatives, the energy in the room was electric. This challenge wasn't a setback. It was a recommitment to our mission. Martha, our first senior partner and now head of the Heritage Recipe Program, summed it up perfectly. "Seems to me your grandma knew exactly what you'd be facing someday. She left you that jar like a time capsule wisdom." That evening, Ella and I sat in our kitchen. Not the commercial one at Graceful Jars, but our home kitchen with its worn countertops and window overlooking a small garden where we planted strawberries earlier that spring. As I stirred a pot of those same strawberries, Now simmering with sugar and lemon juice, Ella rested her hands on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, she'd been craving homemade jam on toast every morning. This will be the first jar for our daughter, I said, testing the consistency with a cold spoon the way Grandma taught me. I think we should name her Grace. Ella smiled, reaching for the labels we designed for our personal batches. Simpler than the commercial ones, but with the same heart. She wrote in her elegant script, "Strawberry for little Grace, so she'll know the taste of love. Summer 2024. As I poured the hot jam into jars, I thought about the circle that had completed itself. From those 25 jars that held Grandma's love, to thousands of jars now carrying that love forward to people I'd never meet. From a grieving grandson trying to hold on to memories, to a father preparing to create new ones. We don't really preserve the past. I've learned. We carry it with us into the future, transforming it as it transforms us. Each jar of jam is both an ending and a beginning, the final moment of summer fruit captured, but also the first moment of something new. Whatever challenges Graceful Jars faces, whatever direction my life takes from here, I know now what Grandma knew all along. The sweetest preserves are the connections between people, the stories we tell, and the love we share across time and distance. Some might call it just jam, but I know better. It's life distilled into its most essential elements, sweetness and tartness, past and future, loss and love, all held together in a simple glass container, waiting to be opened and shared.